So tonight we will be covering water issues. And there are many issues to cover. Our guest speaker, we are pleased to announce, is Mikey Rincon from Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. And Parents Against SSFL acknowledges the original inhabitants of the land that the Santa Susana Field Lab encompasses. The 2,850 acres of land that constitutes SSFL has been utilized by the Ventura Chumash, the Tongva, and the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians indigenous communities for time immemorial. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants and seek meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural homelands and resources. Okay, so I'm going to do the site overview. If this is your third time seeing it, make a cup of tea, but I have to do it because we'll post this, and if we leave it out, we won't see it. The Santa Susana Field Lab is formerly known as Rocketdyne, established in the late 1940s for rocket testing. In 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, was looking for a remote area for a nuclear testing lab. They wanted something remote because it was too dangerous to do in populated areas. SSFL ranked 5th out of 6 for meteorological safety criteria. However, they still picked it due to the convenient drive time to UCLA and USC. This map depicts the land parcels of the various responsible parties at SSFL. So the dark orange is area 4, where the nuclear energy work was done, and the northern buffer zone. These are the responsibilities of the Department of Energy. The medium orange, area 1 and area 2, are both the responsibility of NASA. And the vast majority of the site, the yellow, area 1, area 3, and the southern buffer zone is the responsibility of the Boeing company. This, you can see in the center where the Susana Field Lab is in yellow. You can see the surrounding communities on all sides of the site. The elevation ranges from 2,200 to almost 1,200 feet. So all the communities are downhill. Gravity will pull the contamination from the site down into those communities. Rocket engine tests is the reason why SSFL was established. Over 30,000 rocket engine tests were conducted. 800,000 gallons of trichloroethylene, TCE, was lost into the soil, and 500,000 gallons of TCE remains in a plume under the site. These pictures are of improperly stored hazardous waste materials. Instead of more costly and appropriate transportation of hazardous waste disposal, these bins were brought to these pits dozens a month. And in the top left picture, you can see how they were shot at with rifles to combust that would, thus spread the hazardous materials into the air and be on the site. This is a map depicting area 4. This is where the nuclear work was done. Lots of activity at this area. Over 10 nuclear reactors were held here, 4 of which had accidents, including the sodium reactor experiment that had the partial meltdown. There were also plutonium and uranium fuel facilities, plutonium being one of the most dangerous substances known to man. Again, this area had accidents, explosions, spills, leaks, fires. Some of those, again, were intentional and some were unintentional. This is the image of the sodium reactor experiment. In these days when the early work was being done, the reactors did not have containment structure. So you can see in the top right picture how they would open essentially it looks like a garage door, to vent the contamination during the partial meltdown, in which 13 of the 43 fuel elements melted due to overheating. DTSC will say that radioactive contamination doesn't go off site and that it didn't during the Woolsey fire. But Parents Against SSFL and Mikey, by the way, helped gather samples of soil and dust from individuals in the surrounding communities. Due to limitations on funding and time, our sampling radius ended up being, only 9 miles, but our hottest sample ended up being at the very border of that, showing that yes, indeed, radioactive contamination has got offsite and did after the Woolsey fire. So next week will be our last town hall of this series. We will be covering kind of the most difficult subject, which is the health impacts of all these activities and the unremediated contamination. And especially how these affect women and children. So next week we'll be joined by Dr. Robert Dodge of Physicians for Social Responsibility, again at 6:30. We hope you will register and join us. And I am now going to hand this over to Melissa to cover surface water. Melissa, do you want to show your own screen, or do you want me to click through slides for you?
Why don't you click through? We'll just keep it easy. So we're going to be building up to why all these things matter, how they coincide with drinking water. So it's going to be a little bit of background information. Don't get overwhelmed, but just keep your ears open, because again, this will look how this all plays in. It's all, when we say water is life, you've probably heard that before. And a lot of that talks about the intersection of the different ways water interacts. So I'm going to be talking about some of the surface water, which is also called effluent, which is also called rain runoff. And it impacts the groundwater, the watersheds, the drinking water, crop irrigation, wildlife, water recreation, and Pacific Ocean. So there's a lot of ways that surface water, when it rains at the SSFL and that goes off site, how that brings contamination and impacts other things. Okay, so surface water impacts the Los Angeles River. This is shocking to me when I read this, but during a good storm event, there's the potential for 187 million gallons per day of stormwater runoff that contains pollutants from the SSFL that can discharge into Bell Creek, which is a tributary of the Los Angeles River. So in layman terms, the SSFL has the very, very real potential. And we already have data we'll show you that shows contamination from the SSFL is getting into the LA River, which does end up into the Pacific Ocean. Next. The Cayugas Creek watershed. If you live in Ventura County, you might be more concerned about the Cayugas Creek watershed. The Arroyo Simi, which is on the back of the SSFL, is the back of the SSFL goes down into the Arroyo Simi, which goes into the Cayugas Creek watershed. Next, these are chemicals that have been found historically at the Santa Susana Field Lab, and this is the actual report that we color coded on the left there, and you can see that this shows if it's been detected in the soil, in the surface water, and soil vapor, and water vapor, and like groundwater. It shows all the different things. That's what those X's are. And so it's showing 300 contaminants of concern at the Santa Susana Field Lab that have been detected. However, we're going to be talking about this permit called the NPDES permit, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. Essentially, it allows facilities to dump pollutants into waterways, which completely sounds backwards in the 20th century, that's something that is still allowed to happen. It does, it's legal, and it limits how much pollution, but it still allows these companies to put pollution into waterways. So that permit right now at the Santa Susana Field Lab is only monitoring 35 of these chemicals out of 300. And we're going to be talking again about, why does this matter with drinking water? If they're only measuring 35, that's obviously going to be a problem. So we have a lot to deal with at the SSFL. And in the surface water, because we have so much contamination, remember, our contamination at SSFL isn't buried in deep pits. It's not in barrels stored in a vault. It's actually, most of it's fallout. So it's loose in the groundwater. It's loose in the dirt. And so when it rains, that moves that contamination off site. Next. So here's that NPDES permit that we were talking about. And this is kind of a funky little map, but it's pretty important. I'll explain it to you. Don't worry, you're gonna figure it out. All the little numbers are these stations where they measure how much of this pollution comes through that little station, a measuring station. And then that gets recorded. Okay, so these numbers are these monitoring stations that are set up across the Santa Susana Field Lab, and they monitor how much pollution is coming through that one little station, and then they have to report it back to the water board. You can see here these blue drainages coming off. It goes down Mare Canyon and the northern drainage that goes down into the Arroyo Simi, and on the other side it goes through Bell Canyon and Dayton Canyon. So these are showing the main pathways that stormwater takes pollution from the Santa Susana Field Lab and brings it down into the community. It brings it off site. So every time that that DTSC says that contamination does not go off site, I just want to be like, what crazy pills are you taking? Because obviously it is. Next. Oh, wait, I'm next. Because you can see they have violated that permit. I don't even know how many dozens of times, dozens and dozens of times. They violate this permit all the time. That means that too much pollution is coming off site. And again, we know with those contaminants of concern, there's radioactive material, there's long lasting chemicals, there's the perchlorate rocket fuel. I mean, these are very toxic chemicals that are polluting the waterways. And Boeing, who owns the permit, they violated it so many times. This thing has been a matter of news. This article is from 2007, and by 2007 they already had $500,000. So they've paid almost nearly $1 million, I believe, in fines over the years so far of violating this, of allowing dangerous contaminants to go off-site through the water. Next is me. Keep saying that. After the Woolsey fire, there was a huge amount of contamination coming off site, terrifying amounts. For example, you can see lead here. So they show the control limit. If you look at lead is 5.2. That's how much, according to the LA Water Board, that's how much Boeing is allowed to let lead come off site and pollute local waterways. However, you can see that it was 88 milligrams per liter, not 5.2, 88. That's 17 times the legal limit. And we all know how dangerous lead is, right? If you looked at gross alpha, that's radionuclides. Instead of 15 picocuries per liter, it was about 60. Terrible, terrible amounts. And so this is what we want to point out, is that the contamination at the Santa Susana Field Lab, it gets picked up by the water and it moves off site, and it is taking dangerous contamination off site repeatedly. And the bigger the storm, the more contamination, and the bigger the natural fire, so the fire, it moves the soil up and contamination that may have migrated up into the plants, that gets burned, it turns into smoke, it turns into ash, that can all get moved very easily. So absolutely, the surface water is getting polluted through the Santa Susana Field Lab. Let's see. So save the date. Michaela, you mentioned that you got an email from Boeing. This is what it was about. This is the NPDES permit. We went through this last year with Boeing and the water board, and we found that their permit was terribly inadequate to protect public health. I mean, when you have the Woolsey fire and it's bringing lead 17 times the legal limit, there's no safe exposure to lead. And a list of all these dangerous contaminants, even though there's only 35 that they're actually looking for, which is terrifying to think of the other 270 other contaminants they're not looking for that are obviously going to be coming off site. We need a very strong permit to make sure that our watersheds and our LA River are not polluted by the Santa Susana Field Lab. So please write down this date, September 28th. If you've got scratch paper, write it down, take a photo right now with your camera, do something. You need that date. We need you. We'll probably need you to show up or call in virtually. We need hundreds of people in order to convince the board to do something that they haven't done in the past, which is actually to have a stronger permit against Boeing. That's going to be really important, guys. Ready? So surface water, PCBs in Bell Canyon. PCBs are not good, right? That's a chemical nobody wants around. I believe those are called the forever chemical. Now, this is really interesting. Maybe you've seen this before on our Facebook page. On the bottom here, this is Bell Canyon. This is a community very close to where I live. It's technically Ventura County. It is very affluent. You can see some of those numbers like 1.73 M. That's the cost of that house right there, because I got this off of Realtor's website. These are multi-million-dollar homes. A lot of celebrities have and do live here, including Shaquille O'Neal, apparently, for like 10 years. And you can see that white line and then where it says Santa Susana Field Lab. That is actually the boundary line between where people are living and the field lab. You can see that their backyards are actually butting up to the field lab. This year, when we had major rains in January, I went up with a watershed scientist and we took samples, independent samples of the water runoff coming through Bell Canyon. It's at risk already, we know, because of this study in 2006 by UCLA, that surface water runoff from the SFL goes to Bell Creek, which is Bell Canyon, right? Bell Creek goes through Bell Canyon. And it was detected in those outfalls that we spoke of that go into Bell Canyon. So we're getting the picture here, right? It's coming from the SSFL, it's raining, it's picking up the contamination, and it's bringing it through this NPDES outfall. And it is bringing contamination into Bell Creek and to where these people live. These are pictures from when we did our own personal sampling. If you can see here, can you see my mouse moving? Okay, do you see this little hill line right there? Can you see that little chain link fence? That is the Santa Susana Field Lab fence right there that we're looking at. That's how close these people are living to the Santa Susana Field Lab. And when we got our results back, we found out that a PCB showed up. However, in that NPDES, it says that there should not be any discharge of PCB compounds in the water. So this is shocking. It is obviously not a comprehensive test. We were very limited in funds, but the fact that we took so few samples and still got a hit, a PCB, is very alarming. And it was much higher than the EPA's enforceable maximum contamination limit.
Well, so 3 or 4 samples. It was a very small amount.
It was a very small amount. Yeah. Yep. Very, very small. And we still got PCB in that sample. So it's showing again that this contamination is coming off the Santa Susana Field Lab, is coming into communities, bringing dangerous chemicals. And again, that's why we need to bring this in front of the water board to say, you know, their NPDES shows that this is happening and they're not enforcing it. So we're saying that contaminated water from SSFL should not be going into Bell Canyon. It should not be going into people's homes, but it is. It's a really worst case scenario. And so that's part of the reason why we want to bring your attention to surface water. We're going to see its interaction with groundwater next. Jenny, I'll do the buttons if you want.
Great. So now we're going to get to groundwater, which affects the aquifers and the watersheds. But what you might know is it also has the potential to affect some of our drinking water. Next. One of the issues with groundwater contamination, if we let it get that far, is that it is intensive to remediate, takes more time and more money if it gets to the point where it's filtered into the groundwater. Next slide. So this is a map of the site. You can see the outfalls, the numbers, the little dots. That is where they are monitoring stormwater effluent. If Boeing were to allow too much water to go off-site, where the contamination limits exceed the limits set by the water board, they are then subject to fines. So what they've done is created an infrastructure on site that reroutes the water to specifically 2 places we're going to discuss: the R1 pond, which is unlined, but most specifically the Silvernail pond. It's right there in the middle. Next slide. This is a picture of silver nail. They route the potentially contaminated stormwater to this pond. That long black tube has the little white things attached to it that are like balloons. And so it floats on top of the water. They can filter water from this pond before they discharge it, but they only begin to siphon water when the water level is 8 feet. So if you have a moderate rainstorm where you get 2 feet of rainwater, they are not siphoning the water for treatment. If it's 7 feet, they are not taking the water for treatment. And the issue, there are many issues with this, but one of the issues is that just allows the contamination to settle at the bottom. So it becomes a filtration tank. The issue that it is unlined means that there is a potential for the contamination to contaminate the groundwater. Boeing's expert panel will say that that is not happening because of the clay nature of the soil. But they aren't testing the sediment for contamination, and they aren't calculating volume loss. Next slide.
Can I just say that little icon we put there is because this is something that we're really concerned about. This is something that we need to have addressed because this is a massive way that groundwater can get contaminated when you're taking all the contaminated surface water and putting it into this pond. And granted, they do treat some of the surface water, but if you have to have a whole pond filled up to 8 feet high, and you can see most of the time it is not filled, that's a very dangerous situation.
And the strategy is simply a money-saving strategy for Boeing. It is not doing anything to truly address the contamination issue because they're only addressing it if it's 8 feet deep. DTSC will say that, again, contaminants are not migrating off-site, nor are they migrating off-site in the groundwater. But here you can see a map of plenty of contaminants that have migrated off-site in the groundwater. Next slide. We discussed the TCE plume and passing at the beginning in the site overview. This is actually a map of the plumes. You can see here that they are extending off the site boundary under the ground. We just can't see them. Next slide. This slide refers to a DOE study that characterizes the groundwater and all the different classes of contaminants that it holds, and declared the groundwater at the property to contain contaminants above levels of drinking water standards, and declared that those are unacceptable for unrestricted use. But what we know is that water in Ventura County is being used for crop irrigation, and as we will get to later, drinking water issues, because there's potential for the groundwater to impact wells that I'll let Mikey handle that. We'll go to the next slide. One of the favorite constituents to discuss is tritium, essentially radioactive water. It cannot be filtered out. So this is one of the constituents that cannot be addressed by a reverse osmosis system. Just to show you the seriousness of the issue with tritium, currently groundwater levels of tritium are as high as 119,000 picocuries per liter. The permissible level in drinking water is 20,000. That's a huge difference. Melissa, you love to talk about tritium. Is there anything you wanted to add to this slide?
No, I do want to just disclaim that I'm not sure if that they are still as currently high as 119,000 picocuries per liter.
So they
have been reported at that for sure. And again, that's a very high radioactive level of radioactive water. That's not what we want to be dealing with.
We talk a lot about perchlorates in the groundwater. Out of the gate, we should say that the public health goal, the level the safe level for public health is 1 part per billion. The maximum amount allowed in our drinking water is 6 parts per billion. So there's already an issue with not having stringent enough standards. That's an EPA issue. But it's often discussed where the perchlorate comes from, and there's crosstalk about it. But I think the most important thing is to understand that Dayton Creek is one of the tributaries coming off SSFL, I believe, outfall 8. And in that tributary, perchlorates have been found at 62 million parts per billion. That's extremely high. So the perchlorate issues should not be just swept under the rug on site.
Hey, Jenny.
Yes.
Did you know what parts per billion means? I looked it up today. You want to know? It's one. It would be, so for example, if the public health goal is 1 part per billion, that is 1 drop in a billion gallons of water. It's insane. Right. It's insanely small. Perchlorate is very dangerous.
Yes.
I just want to throw that in.
It affects us, our intellectual development, similarly to lead. So most people would say, well, it's groundwater, it's under the ground, it's down there, it's not affecting us. And maybe, you don't drink water that could be contaminated by it. But the water table at SSFL is in places shallow, and that water comes back up through seeps during rain events. It almost looks when you're driving through the area, sometimes like it's overflowing. So there are seeps and springs where the groundwater will come up. And in that sense, the wildlife has the potential to be affected. I've got William Bowling in the chat saying, and it can come up through contamination, can come up through water vapors. Thank you, Bill. A great quote that I think is poignant from Tevin Schmidt, the watershed scientist from Wishtoyo Chumash Foundation. I will read it to you. Quote, SSFL has been and continues to pollute the surrounding watershed and groundwater basins for decades, causing irreparable harm to sensitive plants, wildlife, and residents of the nearby areas. So we're going to get to the 2023 groundwater report. The 2023 groundwater report showed high levels, certain contaminants having their detection amounts higher than they've ever been seen. And we don't have the expertise to even pose appropriate questions as to why that might be. Michael might want to jump in at some point, but what we do know is that the 2023 groundwater report shows that contamination levels in groundwater are not stagnant, are not necessarily staying the same. Levels are changing, and so therefore monitoring needs to be happening, consistently, and testing needs to be happening often. This is the 2023 groundwater report. You can see that radium-226 had a new maximum detection. Strontium-90, also a radionuclide, also had a new maximum detection, as did uranium-235, 236. So Dan Hirsch from Committee to Bridge the Gap, which many of you are familiar with as an expert on the Santa Susana Field Lab, is quoted as saying the strontium-90 is astronomical, 15 times the legal limit. So this is 2023 SSFL groundwater data. It's a bit alarming. So you would think in a situation where we're not seeing all the levels decrease and politely go away as we would like, some of them are increasing in places, that the state would, be moved and motivated to actively remediate the groundwater contamination and have that groundwater remedy in place as they were supposed to in 2017. Unfortunately, DTSC has done the complete opposite. They've reversed that position of requiring a complete groundwater cleanup, and they've issued a groundwater covenant that has essentially streamlined the idea of leaving groundwater untreated for an undetermined amount of time, ignoring the potential for groundwater to migrate to other aquifers and, to people, areas that maybe people have no idea that SSFL even exists. And it allows Boeing to continue to use groundwater on site for dust suppression and irrigation. So we're allowing Boeing to continue to bring that contaminated water up and continue to use it so that it has another chance to migrate offsite. So Jeff Rook from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility has given wonderful quotes on this. I will read them both to you. This deal condemns Santa Susana to serve as a perpetual sacrifice zone dedicated to corporate convenience. Bottling up a toxic plume for eternity and then walking away is a deal most polluters would love. Indeed. And we would like to hand this over to our near and dear Mikey Rincon.
Hello, hello. Let's go into the next slide. Hi, everyone. Some of you may know me, you may not. But my name is Michael Rincon. I go by Mikey. I am the Research and Policy Manager at Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles. I also currently lead our clean water program, which has been focusing on addressing drinking water issues across Los Angeles County and Southern California, with the goal of making sure that the human right to water is achievable for all communities. And so today I will be talking about how sites such as the Santa Susana Field Lab could potentially be affecting drinking water for local communities surrounding these type of sources. However, please note that due to the complexity of literally what is drinking water, I will not necessarily be making any claims or conclusions about the site, about if the site is directly affecting local drinking water, but instead we'll discuss how the current conditions we find ourselves in with this site could be contributing to a larger environmental risk to the community, as well as to the overall burden Southern California is facing when it comes to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible drinking water. So as mentioned earlier, there are over 300 chemicals of concern or contaminants of concern found in soil and water that are associated with the operations that have occurred at SSFL during its lifespan. Though the rocket tests have stopped and there is no prototype nuclear reactors on site, the chemicals and radioactive contamination left behind still remains a problem. And stories like this of what's going on at SSFL that are also occurring in other communities, maybe not to the toxic extent of SSFL, but the principle is. Next slide, please. So before anything, I really want to provide a bit of context. That's a bit different than what Jenny and Melissa have shared already. So if you haven't been too caught up on California water issues recently, here's a crash course. We just experienced a record-breaking drought after a previous record-breaking drought. Not to mention that the entire Western United States has been in a 20-year mega drought that is progressively getting worse each year. Though we just had a very wet winter, that has improved drought conditions for a majority of the state. And this coming year has also been determined to be an El Nino year, which means that we will for sure have a very wet and cold winter coming up. It is still believed that we will not have enough water available for California to be considered safe from drought and the accompanying possibility of water shortages. In fact, it's more of a paradox because we will actually have enough water in the form of rain and snow drenching the entire state to meet demand. However, our infrastructure and natural environment cannot absorb that water fast enough to keep California's reservoirs and local water aquifers safe and at a healthy level. In fact, the South Coast region of California, which entails Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties, naturally holds about 10% of the state's total freshwater resources, which we use for drinking water, recreation, and for the lakes and rivers that also sustain fish and wildlife. However, this exact same region, the South Coast region, holds more than half of the state's population, not to mention the number of industries and commercial buildings that also, need water. So from a logistical standpoint, there just isn't enough water to sustain Southern Californians and our way of life. Instead of adapting to these conditions, we have gone to great lengths to bring water to Southern California from places like the Colorado River, because we have not learned or accepted the fact that water in Southern California is very limited. And instead of cutting back and being responsible, we have strained not just local resources, but resources outside of the region when it comes to water. So, for example, this past fall, the Colorado River was nearing dead pool levels in certain areas, which is when there is not enough water to reach the intake valves that deliver the river's water to the communities that depend on it, such as those in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. California, more specifically, Southern California, is the largest consumer of the Colorado River's water, with very few restrictions on how much we can actually take. And because of that, we have contributed to this problem, and climate change is exacerbating it. So across Southern California, most water customers receive a blend of local groundwater or surface water, and the rest has to be imported in from either the Colorado River or the State Water Project. Usually it's about 40% local water resources and 60% imported that we receive out of our taps. And climate change is not only causing groundwater wells to dry up, but it is also affecting sources of drinking water that we depend on from outside the region, such as the Colorado. You're likely wondering, Mikey, why are you talking about all this? Well, the Colorado River crisis has actually forced California now to cut back significantly on its dependency on water from the Colorado River, which means we must now be forced to adapt to these conditions. And it means it is crucial that we protect all of our already limited water resources available to us right now. And if climate change isn't enough to worry about when it comes to water insecurity, we also have to address the reality that that there are a number of toxic contaminants that are affecting local water quality and ultimately affects all of our health, especially when there are countless numbers of toxic sources, that can be found across Southern California and its drinking water. Next slide. So this leads back into SSFL. SSFL sits upon a very significant location that can affect local hydrology. The headwaters of the Los Angeles River start at the base of SSFL as they move downhill east into the San Fernando Valley and the Los Angeles River Basin. Though technically no one actually gets their water directly from the Los Angeles River itself, there are wells throughout the LA River Basin that do provide drinking water supply to Angelenos. Now to the north and even southwest, water flowing off-site can go into the Cayuegas watershed. The Thousand Oaks Westlake Village area doesn't necessarily use local groundwater, but does use local surface water as a drinking water source. While as you go into the Santa Rosa Valley and even Camarillo, groundwater wells are used for both agricultural and for drinking water purposes. So no matter which direction the contaminants travel from the site, it has the potential to affect local drinking water downstream and even downwind, really. Next slide. So though the rocket tests have stopped, and like I said, the prototype nuclear reactors are no longer on site, the toxic and radionuclide contamination is still a problem left behind, with the potential to create another problem for local drinking water and public health. Next slide. So in the case of drinking water, we advocates often talk about a precautionary approach on addressing drinking water quality. So the way that we also talk about this is that any form of toxic releases, such as chemicals, radionuclides, VOCs, heavy metals, etc., from air emissions, from industrial dust, wastewater that is released into air, soil, will almost always end up in water. However, depending on the contaminant, its interactions with the environment will vary compared to other contaminants. So if you're a Superfund site, an oil refinery, or even a resident pouring down a cleaner down the drain, whatever we choose to release or allow to be released into the environment ultimately affects our water and subsequently our health. Though we don't have the time to go through every single contaminant associated with SSFL, I will explain what having a large source of contaminants can potentially mean for local drinking water, the community stakeholders, the responsible parties, as well as the regulating agencies. But before getting into the contaminants, I first feel that I need to explain the difference between an MCL and a PHG, or a public health goal, as this does put things into perspective when it comes to assessing the extent of the impact on drinking water. So let's start with the MCL, which is a maximum contaminant level. It is set by US EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And what an MCL does is that it sets a legal requirement for a water purveyor, aka your water utility, to guarantee that a contaminant does not exceed this level. However, there are some flaws with the MCLs, which I will get into in a minute. But before you establish an MCL for a contaminant, first you have to establish the public health goal, which at the federal level is a health-based drinking water standard that says at this concentration, there would be very minimal health impacts if present in drinking water and if people consume it. However, unlike MCLs, public health goals are not legally enforced. This is where things get like a little tricky about MCLs, because MCLs are not a health-based drinking water standard. An MCL is a best available technology standard. So for example, if the best available technology, say, is granular activated carbon treatment system to remove lead, for example, but at its highest and most efficient performance still leaves the presence of lead 100 times higher than the public health goal, then that's technically what it will be set at. And all the water purveyors will have to oblige to that standard. And there are some other factors that also go into setting an MCL, but it's usually the best available technology factor that matters the most, which is unfortunate because it can mean that a contaminant can still be present in your drinking water. There's not much that can be done legally because there are certain limitations. Which is why, if you look here at the difference between MCLs and public health goals, you see that the MCLs are set at a much more lenient level than a public health goal is at. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Though the US EPA does not set the US EPA does set the federal standards, states can always build off of these to set more protective MCLs or public health goals. For example, the main difference between California and federal public health goals is that the federal public health goal sets a standard in which there's minimal health impacts, such as 1 in a million cancer risk, while the California public health goals are set at a level where there is no health impacts whatsoever if an exposure occurs, which can make a huge difference when establishing MCLs. Ultimately, the water utility is required to comply with whichever MCL is more protective. And I also want to clarify something else about MCLs when we talk about this site as well. There are upwards of 10,000 different drinking water contaminants associated with the US market, all of which could end up in drinking water. However, we only have MCLs available for roughly 120 different drinking water contaminants because of a lack of data, epidemiological studies, research, or even identified technology or methods that even can remove the contaminant itself. Next slide. So I also want to talk about what happens if there is a contaminant present that may not have an MCL but has been detected in drinking water. So the state of California has a drinking water source standard called the response level, which is used when an MCL has not been established yet. If a contaminant exceeds the response level in a drinking water source, such as a groundwater well or even a surface water creek or lake, the state water board can require the water utility to no longer use that specific source until either conditions improve or that the water utility is able to show that it can effectively remove the contaminant to protect public health. Next slide. So when it comes to understanding the impact SSFL, yeah, no, you're fine. Yeah, that's it. So when it comes to understanding the impact SSFL could be having on local drinking water, we do have to take it with a grain of salt until proven otherwise, because some contaminants could be associated with multiple sources. For example, some may be naturally occurring, but by understanding the region, the nature of the contaminant, the distance from potential sources, you can really paint a solid picture of what's contributing to the problem and why addressing potential sources not only benefits public health overall, but also protects our drinking water resources. So for example, let's start with TCE. TCE is a synthetic, toxic, clear, colorless liquid that has an odor similar to ether or chloroform, and has traditionally been used as a solvent to remove grease from metal parts, or in the case of SSFL, was used to clean out rocket engines. TCE is highly mobile in soil and can result in groundwater contamination if present in soil. That can not be addressed easily, as it is actually denser than water and will actually sink to the bottom of an aquifer, subsequently destroying the structure of clay materials, making an aquifer much more vulnerable to other dissolved contaminants. This can be a problem also because for groundwater well owners, if they drill deeper, they can actually take up more TCE than any other time, because it's towards the bottom. Perchlorate, here's a not so fun one. Perchlorate is often used to produce in the United States to produce nitrate fertilizers, explosives, or other fiery products. However, in the United States, high levels of perchlorate are normally associated with military operations, weapons development, or weapons manufacturing. But because we are talking about the military, perchlorate associated operations in the United States are kept confidential, and we cannot actually determine if one particular source is solely responsible compared to others. However, I'd like to add here that there are a very few number of nitrate fertilizer manufacturers in California, none of which are located in Ventura County, and those located in Los Angeles County are located in East LA. And also nitrate fertilizers are typically used for corn. So unless someone's growing corn at an industrial scale near these residential, near these residences, by SSFL, then it really narrows down the potential sources of perchlorates. Lead. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, lead. Lead is the most heavily regulated drinking water contaminant in the United States. There is no safe level of exposure of lead, and children are much more susceptible to the permanent cognitive impacts associated with exposure. Because of that, EPA and Cal EPA have gone to great lengths to limit the presence of lead in consumer goods and establish water treatment standards to remove lead from drinking water. Widespread lead contamination in drinking water sources, which is before it gets treated, is typically associated with anthropogenic sources such as metals manufacturing or metal waste, the burning of anything really. Yeah, so potential sources, the burning of any materials, gasoline emissions, ammunition, the disposal of batteries. However, if the water purveyor, so your water utility, shows that there's no exceedances of lead in their water distribution system, which is like after the water gets treated, but you still end up finding it at your tap, then it's likely from aging service lines or premise plumbing. And that's how you also start to differentiate, what's the real problem, what is, affecting your drinking water. Arsenic can be naturally occurring contaminant as well, found in soil and in groundwater materials, fossil fuels, metal production. I think we have coal power plants in the hills of Simi or mining operations. So again, it really narrows down the potential sources of where the high levels of arsenic are coming from. Specific contaminants, but are grouped categories of radionuclides, which are the contaminants. So alpha and beta particles are the types of radiation given off by certain radionuclides, and that can also be found, like in the sun. How can you tell if it's associated with SSFL? Well, it's the specific particle. For example, strontium exists naturally and is found in earth metals. However, strontium-90 specifically is man-made through nuclear fission operations or procedures. So unless I miss David Attenborough talk about how nuclear reactors are in the wild, or someone created a mini nuclear reactor in their backyard, again, it really narrows down the potential sources of where all this is coming from. Or in the case of tritium, that can naturally be found in water in very, very low levels. Any form of elevated, any elevated level of tritium is typically associated with nuclear reactors. So again, it's about understanding the entire concept and not the concept, the context and landscape of the region that helps us identify potentially what is affecting our drinking water. Next slide. So I talk about all this because it is sites like SSFL that are creating other environmental problems that affect, drinking water issues. So for example, in the Simi Valley area, some residents may be served by the Golden State Water Company, which is a large investor-owned utility with a list of individual water systems that they own across California. The thing about Golden State Water's Simi Valley water system specifically is that it does use a blend of local groundwater and imported water resources to provide your drinking water to its or the water that it provides to its customers. Next slide. So here, just very briefly, here is an image of the two wells to give perspective that Golden State owns and operates and uses for their water. And it also shows the distance from SSFL, but also kind of, provides a picture of the potential vulnerability that it has related to the contaminants at SSFL and groundwater plumes, because gravity is generally a driving force when it comes to the way that contaminants travel through groundwater. Next slide. And lastly, here we have a screenshot of the Golden State Water Company's. This is the Golden State Water Company's service area. So if you live within the service area, chances are that you are receiving a blend of this water. However, this does not necessarily guarantee that the contaminants present in those wells are ending up in your specific tap water, and there's a lot of reasons as to why that happens. But I still, want to take a step back and say that the risk still exists until the site is addressed. Next slide. And this is my last one, but so lastly, here we have a screenshot of Golden State Water Company's 2023 Consumer Confidence Report, which is an annual water quality report for certain contaminants as required by law and is available publicly. But I wanted to point to you the highlighted paragraph that shows that even Golden State Water is aware that their groundwater resources are vulnerable to contaminant plumes, in this case referring to perchlorate. They don't say SSFL specifically, but after what we just covered on perchlorate, you can't rule it out that it's SSFL until the site is completely cleaned up. And so with that, I want to end with this. Climate change is adding a significant strain to Southern California's dwindling water resources, and toxic industries and sites such as SSFL are exacerbating the problem because it's causing what little potable water we have available to be unsafe for consumption. And when local water utilities struggle to meet legal requirements for water quality, they get penalized financially, or or to avoid, penalties, will invest in necessary upgrades and maintenance. And who bears the burden of the costs but the water customers? Water bills in California are already extremely high compared to the national average, and every day more and more households struggle to pay for their water service. It is why it's imperative that sites like SSFL get cleaned up ASAP so we can protect our local water resources, because the way that we water advocates are seeing for the near future, which is literally the next 5 to 10 years, we are anticipating water shortages. we are anticipating day zero scenarios, which is when you open up your tap and nothing comes out. We are also anticipating higher water rates, that are coming. And Southern California's total water resource capacity will decrease if we don't take care of our local water. And if we don't learn how to conserve as well and change our lives, our lifestyles as well. And if those undesired outcomes do occur, the concentration of toxic contaminants present in those groundwater wells across the region will actually increase, creating a ticking time bomb for a severe water crisis in Southern California. And this is what I deal with every single day. And it also keeps me up at night because I'm not just focusing on Simi and Thousand Oaks, I'm focusing on California as a whole. Now that you have all this information, now you're like wondering, well, what do we do? Well, here's a couple things that we all can do, to put pressure to make some change. The California State Water Board Division of Drinking Water can take steps to protect public health by requiring additional sampling for contaminants of concern, which also aids in assessing proper treatment techniques to remove these contaminants at the water utility end of things. The Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, who has significant authority to hold the responsible parties accountable and also, signs off on these wastewater permits, play a crucial role because they see these wastewater permits, it is actually their duty to not only ensure that there is not a surplus of wastewater contaminants from all the different polluters, but it is also their duty to reduce the number of wastewater permits that are required by working to address the sources of these contaminants or the sites, which could be presented as requiring these permit holders to implement new technology that better suits the type of wastewater that they're dealing with. They can influence the manufacturing changes in certain industries, or they haven't really done this, but there's nothing that says they can't. They can even really put pressure on getting a site cleaned up, because if a site was cleaned up in the first place, there wouldn't be a need for a wastewater permit because the source of the contaminant was addressed. There's definitely more I could say, but for the sake of density and time, I'll save it for another time. But overall, that's everything I had to share. And so thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you for advocating for all of us to help us find cleaner, safer solutions for the future. You're amazing. Okay.
Yeah, I don't sleep much.
Run through it. In 2018, there was a feasibility study that essentially wanted to investigate is groundwater in the Simi Valley Basin suitable for a drinking water source? And one of the interesting things found was alpha radioactivity above the MCLs. Next slide. So we're going to go back to the Golden State water issue. I am going to give myself a disclaimer, which is I understand, and we are presenting that we're not presenting that any laws are being broken. We understand that Golden State's practices are well within, the legal parameters of the law. But we're going to give you the following information. Golden State Water uses the drinking water blend, as Mikey mentioned, and in 2019, the Division of Drinking Water presented to Simi Valley residents at City Hall that at times, Golden State Water may use a blend from 10% to 67% well water in their drinking water blend. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can see this, but this is also from Golden State Water's, a screenshot from their consumer report. The part that I'd like to go over here, this is the untreated groundwater. Okay, this is before blending. And I can't even see it with my readers, but there are two lines that discuss the radioactive constituents. And
sorry, I tried to zoom in, that didn't work.
It's okay. So at the top, you have these columns. You have the MCL column, you have the public health goal column, You have a range of detection, which we're not going to go into. You have an average level. So out of the gate, you need to know that the data that they're reporting is not from an individual sampling event, but averaged from multiple sampling events. Then you have most recent sampling date. If you look at radioactive constituents, the most recent sampling date was 2020. This report was published at the end of 2022. Next slide, please. Their disclaimer in the same report is that the state allows us to monitor for some contaminants less than once per year because the concentrations do not change frequently. Some of our data, while representative, is more than a year old. I would like to remind everyone on this call of the groundwater report under SSFL that was released this year, showing that indeed the groundwater concentrations of chemical and radioactive constituents are fluctuating, they are changing. So while the practices are within the legal confines of the law, my personal question as a resident and Golden State Water customer is it safe enough? Next slide. There are a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know if, because they're required to sample, I believe, quarterly for most constituents that the EPA says they have to sample for. But what I don't know, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this information. If I do, I will definitely share it with you and update it appropriately when we publish this PowerPoint. We don't know that if when they have a sampling event, we don't know the percentage of well water they are using during that sampling event. We don't know if they're sampling when they're only using 10%, or if they're actually sampling and publishing data when they're using up to 67%. So for my personal opinion, that just makes me nervous because I can't answer that question. My other question is, since Golden State Water is blending, they have the potential to blend with their imported water source, why are they not achieving the public health goals for these contaminants? I didn't show you the blend. I think we took the slide out for time, but when you can see the averages for the actual drinking water blend, they're all within the MCL limits, but the public health goals are not always being met. And again, this goes back to the issue that for some of the constituents at SSFL, MCLs and public health goals have not yet been established. And so I was talking with Mike earlier today, and he said that that to get constituents at SSFL regularly monitored and tested for through the water company, that would be handled through the water board. At this point in time, we don't know what contaminants of concern from SSFL the private water company is testing for, because on their website, they're only showing for the things that were detected. They're not showing the constituents that were not detected. So we do not yet have a comprehensive list of what they're testing for in terms of what Golden State Water has put on their website. Next slide, please. So protecting ourselves. If you're a Golden State Water customer, you might be kind of nervous. When I found out about this, I got really nervous. This is a picture of my daughter, Cora. Our choice was to do something affordable and order sparklets. That's what we do. A more protective choice would be to get an in-home reverse osmosis system. That would be much better, but when we priced it in 2019, upon learning about these issues, it was a $4,000 splurge. And many of the communities surrounding the lab have a good proportion of working class folks for whom that's a lot of money. That's a big ask. And it is my personal opinion that we should not have to do that. This becomes an environmental justice issue where we're asking people that may not be able to, sorry, let me rephrase that. No one's asking them to, but it should not be required or needed for us to provide our own drinking water filtration systems. The biggest question we ever get from Messenger, Facebook questions is, how do I test my water? How do I find out if the contamination is affecting my water? which was the first question I had when finding out about Golden State using well water. And at that time, I made my first phone call to Dan Hirsch, the SSFL expert, and he said, don't test, because when you test, it's very expensive, and all you're getting is a snapshot in time. You don't know what was in the water last week, and it's not going to show you what's going to be in the water tomorrow. And as we've discussed in this presentation, contaminants are moving, the levels are changing. It would be so expensive to even attempt to get a comprehensive view of your water in your home, because nobody can afford to test it every time they pour a drink of water out of their tap. But we feel very strongly that the thing that we can do that will help everyone is contact our local representatives, ask for a full cleanup, ask for groundwater remedy, and demand that they, both the counties and the cities have all passed motions to support a full cleanup. Let them know that we want them to continue to push through for that. We do not want to accept the environmental impact reports breaking of those cleanup agreements. Next slide. Go for it, Melissa.
All right, so next steps, this is gonna look familiar to you. We are asking you to reach out to your elected officials. Also, we're asking you to save the date for that Water Quality Control Board meeting. So it can be a really simple message. It could be an email, it could be a phone call, and just saying that I'm concerned. I'm a resident. I'm concerned that the Department of Toxic Substance Control isn't doing a good job with the Santa Susana Field Lab, that their environmental impact report will leave over 90% of the soil contamination on site, and that I want the full cleanup. It doesn't have to sound like a scientist. In fact, it's better if it doesn't. It's much better if it comes from the heart and if it comes from you. And I told this story the other day. I actually got to do an Oppenheimer screening, which was kind of cool. They had a panel at this certain screening a few days ago. One of the things I told them was, once I was in Washington, D.C., and I saw a state representative, not state, it was Assembly member Brad Sherman walking down the hall, and I just yelled, "I'm a constituent!" And he turned on his heel and was like, "Do you like a photo?" And that just shows, like, these people are insanely busy. They're dealing with huge issues, but they love their constituents. We matter to them, and our voices are powerful. So it can be a simple statement. Do we have that? Did we take the map out, Jenny?
Did you already?
There it is. I just skipped over it by accident. One of the groups that we're hoping to target are our board of supervisors, because they're the ones who would be able to take action over this last final environmental impact report. If you missed that town hall, we recorded it. You can go on to Parents Against SSFL on YouTube and find it there from 2 weeks ago, where we go into depth about the final programmatic environmental impact report. So one of the things you can do is reach out to your supervisors. If you're feeling extra energetic, you can reach out to your state assembly members. You can reach out to your state senators. You can reach out to your city council members. You could reach out to a friend and say, we need to work on this, because we need a lot of people. It's going to actually take a lot of us to stand up to our elected, not stand up, but to speak out to our elected officials to make sure they actually take action on this. They've got a lot of pressure on them. They've got a lot of things to do. And if they don't hear the squeaky wheel, it really won't get fixed. That is a really true, simple advice. We need everybody to literally on this call, like, call 3 people afterwards and say, hey, here's what I'm going to say. Here's the email address. Why don't you do it too? Make it easy for them. Mikey, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think on calling the representatives, if you call anyone in California, like state or county, another thing you can add as well, if you didn't know, California passed a law in 2012 called the Human Right to Water, which pretty much says that as long as you live in California, you have the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible drinking water for the purposes of consumption. So you can even say that, you know what, it's possible. I'm a resident, and I believe that the SSFL may be affecting my human right to water. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't know about, and you can actually use very often to address these, to bring up concerns. And then on the water thing that, like that Jenny was talking about, like the at-home filter systems and stuff like that. The way that I've been talking about it, because I mean, with the communities that I normally work with in LA, I mean, no one drinks their tap because they don't trust it. I do, and I'm in Thousand Oaks, like I drink my tap, but that's, my choice as well, because I trust it, and that for my own reasons. But at the end of the day, here's the thing. You should do whatever you think is best for your own well-being. Whatever makes you feel safer. If you believe that the tap's the option, and you want to do the filter, go for it. If you think, the bottled water option is best for you, go for it. At the end of the day, what matters is that you are hydrated, especially now that it's starting to get really hot. Because though the radiation will, can affect you, a year from now, 2 years from now, if you don't have water for 3 days, you're dead. So, I'm messing around, but I mean, I want to reassure you that yes, this is a problem. Yes, this could be affecting us, but at the end of the day, you still need to drink water. You still need to stay hydrated. So whatever you feel is best for you, you should be able to do, and you shouldn't feel bad about it either. But you can also, just always say but you can express like, yeah, I'm not happy about this. I have a problem with it. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I see you, Dory. You have a question. I see you. You can unmute.
Okay. Well, I have two questions. One, is the radiation in our the Chatsworth in with our water?
I don't know. I don't know even data about the municipal water source in Simi where I live. I've only focused on the Golden State simply because I knew that the EPA had stated that the wells there was a potential for the wells to be contaminated. Melissa, can you speak to it?
Well, we have put out requests and some detailed questions. I don't think we've had enough time for them to get back to us yet. So we might end up doing a follow-up. We'll probably do another Zoom before the NPDES permit. But it's hard to tell. And again, what's coming out of one person's tap isn't going to be the same coming out of the other. It's like all of SSFL. Not everyone is going to get sick from it, but the most vulnerable should be protected. And as a society with a moral compass, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that all of us are safe,
Right.
and that all of us are free from the contamination. So I'm sorry, I don't have a more specific answer for you, Dory, but we will share our findings once we get them.
And then my second question is, for the NPDES, I mean, I know the LA Water Board screwed us. So doing the one in Ventura, how is that different?
They just released, sorry, Melissa, did you want to take it? They just released the new proposed permit. We are going to be going through it with a few other groups to see how it's different from the last proposed permit that they said they were going to, republish, which now they have. We don't know because we haven't had time to start looking at it. So we're having a meeting Friday. We're going to start analyzing it. And once we have information about how much it's weakened, or goodness gracious, maybe there's a miracle and they strengthened it, but we just don't know yet. We haven't laid eyes on it.
Okay.
But it's happening.
Julie, your hand is up.
Thank you. Again, I'm in awe of all the information. I really appreciate your very thoughtful presentation. I know that there's been quite a bit said about the Golden State water, because I had asked last week, do we know anything about, I think it's Ventura County Water Works or Public Work Agency, the other water that comes into Simi Valley? Do we have any statistical information on it? The gentleman that spoke a little while ago, because a lot of the information had to do with Golden State. Do you have any information on the other water department that is about half of the western part of Simi Valley? Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I mean, again, every single water provider or utility, whether it's a private or public entity with the city or the county, all of them are required to publish an annual water quality report. So it should be available on their website. And if not, like, you can always call and ask for it, and they have to give it to you no matter what.
And I will say that drinking water in California, it meets the legal requirements. You know, sometimes we're concerned that the legal requirements aren't safe enough, and sometimes the legal requirements aren't testing for things that come off of Superfund sites. Because most
Exactly.
of these
Yeah.
water sources
Yeah,
aren't.
because that's what I covered too, is that, you know, like, the MCLs are useful, but they're not perfect.
Right.
So, you know, again, you know, whatever we end up
Yeah.
giving you in terms of, like, information, you know, the good and the bad, you know, you always got to take it with a grain of salt.
Julie, would it help
Until we
if
know more.
I found the Callegas water report for you and emailed it to you? I don't mind doing that. We're constantly researching. I can find the consumer water report for you. And
I don't know who you're talking to. You're talking to me?
yes, Julie.
Oh, okay. You have my email address, correct? You already have it there. Okay.
The one thing I can tell you is the question that we have for them, that one of the questions that we sent is that Bard Lake is a water supplier. It's several miles from the Santa Susana field lab, but we're still concerned that some contamination could blow into it. We're not sure at this point if it's used for only emergency water. That's kind of what it looks like. It looks like the majority of the water in Ventura County is brought in from Northern California, not even the Colorado River. So,
So let me, if I could just make sure I understand the answer to my question, that the state of California allows so much of whatever the toxic, whatever the amount is, but obviously it's going to be different in Simi Valley than it will be in Northern California, but it's the same. What they disallow in Northern California, they disallow in Simi Valley as well, even though the contamination may be 1,000 times worse. I don't even understand it.
Yeah, technically it's up to your utility to test for it and to address the problem, because they're the ones who are purchasing the water or receiving it from wherever it's coming from, and it's their responsibility to make sure that it's safe for consumption.
And the question is, how truthful are they? I mean, is this something that they can make look better than it is, or is that illegal, or what?
Well, I don't think that they can falsify. I mean, I don't think that anyone's falsifying the data, but my personal question about Golden State Water is the timing, the amount of well water they're using and the timing of the sampling. And we don't yet know, and maybe we will find out. And if we do, we will be, you know, extremely transparent about it.
And you had mentioned before, I'm sorry, I wrote so many notes, I'm looking at them right now, about the reverse osmosis, okay? And that it does help for some things, but you definitely said for the tritium that it does not. How many others? Perchlorate, lead, strontium.
So I can answer that. So reverse osmosis, the way it works is that it specifically it uses like a membrane filter and pretty much has like these little holes in it, and the only thing that passes through that membrane are literally only water molecules, but there are some contaminants that are smaller than that, and that sometimes also applies to radiation. So what I would say is that reverse osmosis can definitely get rid of a good amount of things, especially on the chemical side. But there's no guarantee that it's removing everything.
Okay, just the last thing I wanted to say, the most amazing picture that you showed tonight, which just blows my mind, is the sign at the lab where, you know, do not only drink bottled water. That is, I mean, if that isn't the picture of representing everything that we're all fighting against, you should have that when you go into the meetings and all, you know, you go to the water resource boards and all of that, you should all be carrying that. Anyway, thank you. I don't mean to take up so much time.
Kit put a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, Melissa.
Go for it.
A question about the NPDES permits and fines. Do you all know where to go see what fines, if any, have been assessed against Boeing for permit violations over time? That will be on the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board's website, won't it? Melissa and
Also know a fabulous other website called parentsagainstsantasusannafieldlab.com/water. It may not be as comprehensive, so I would definitely take Jenny's recommendation for every legal one, but we have tried to summarize the fines. And again, it's been going on for decades. And especially when there's drought, there's not a whole lot of contamination coming off site. That makes sense. When there's big storm events, we see a lot of contamination coming off site. And go ahead.
I was gonna just remind him that there's a difference between exceedances of limits and fines actually.
Yeah, a lot of fines have been waived many times.
They've spent a lot of money, but there's also a lot of money that they should have had to spend that they haven't.
Also, can I just throw this out for NPDES, and we'll go over this again when it gets closer to the meeting, and we need you guys to make really informed, intelligent, personal remarks to the Water Quality Control Board, because they've listened to those, is that 2 of the outfalls that get, I think, 60% of the effluent coming off site, that contaminated water, are called benchmarks. That means that they do not actually get fined for any of the contamination above the maximum contamination limits. So it means all those other outfalls that get the other 30% of the contamination, those are the only places where they're actually getting fined for it. There's no good reason for that, except that it saves Boeing a boatload of money. And we don't think that the money is what Boeing really cares about, because honestly, like $100,000 fine to Boeing, they probably, spend more on that at Christmas Eve parties than water board fines. But it's proof that this is coming off site and it's a violation. And I think that's what bothers them more. So we've got these 2 benchmarks that are not fining them for huge amounts of violations. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's shockingly, horrifically, glaringly unfair and against public health concerns. So that's something we'll be bringing up.
And
Okay,
those,
go for it. And then I think this will be our last question, you guys. You're amazing for staying on this long. You want to ask?
good. It's great to see everybody. Thank you so much.
Okay, good night.
Night, everybody.
Thank you.